Hey guys, winter in the Middle Ages was not just a season of snow, smoke, and quiet villages. For ordinary people, it could feel like time itself had slowed down, as if the whole world had been locked inside cold earth. Thin daylight, damp clothing, and rooms that never quite became warm. What makes it stranger is that medieval winter was not always dramatic in the way we imagine. Often, it was the small discomforts, repeated every day, that made it feel endless. Before we settle into that world, tell me where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like to hear next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, leaving a like is a simple way to support it. Subscribe as well if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating history to listen to at night. So let's step slowly into the medieval cold, not as kings or knights in painted halls, but as ordinary people trying to get through another dark morning. The first thing to understand is that medieval winter was not only about temperature. It was about limits. It was about how little control most people had over light, heat, food, travel, work, illness, and time. Modern life allows winter to be softened by switches, sealed windows, insulated walls, artificial light, stored fuel, public transport, and food systems that keep shelves full even when fields are frozen. Medieval people had none of that protection in the same way. They did not simply experience winter as weather. They experienced it as a tightening of the entire world. For a peasant household in much of medieval Europe, winter began long before the first snow. It began in late autumn when the fields had to be prepared, animals had to be sorted, firewood had to be gathered, grain had to be stored, roofs had to be repaired, and every small weakness in a household suddenly mattered. A cracked wall, a poor harvest, a sick cow, a leaking roof, a damp stack of firewood, a missing cloak, a dead ode after harvest. These were not minor inconveniences. They were the kinds of details that could shape the entire season ahead. And this is where modern viewers often misunderstand medieval winter. We tend to picture one hard storm, one freezing night, one dramatic struggle against the cold. But for ordinary people, the difficulty was not usually one single crisis. It was accumulation, a little less bread, a little more damp, a little less daylight, a little more smoke in the room, a little more sickness among children, a little more mud around the doorway, a little more anxiety about whether the stored food would last until spring. Medieval people were not helpless, and they were not foolish. They understood the rhythm of the year with a closeness many of us have lost. They knew when to slaughter animals that could not be fed through winter. They knew how to preserve meat with salt or smoke when resources allowed. They knew how to patch clothing, store root vegetables, dry herbs, share work, and gather indoors when the weather made outdoor labor dangerous. But knowledge did not remove hardship. It only made survival possible. The cold entered ordinary life quietly. It came through walls made of wattle and daub, timber, turf, stone, or packed earth, depending on region and wealth. It seeped under doors and around shutters. Glass windows were rare for most rural households, so openings were often closed with wooden shutters, cloth, oiled parchment, or nothing substantial at all. To block the cold was often to block the light. To let in daylight was to let in wind. Every comfort had a cost. Inside a poor cottage, warmth usually centered on the hearth. The fire was not just a pleasant domestic feature. It was the household's engine. It cooked food, warmed bodies, dried clothing, smoked meat, heated water, and gathered the family into one shared space. But the hearth was also imperfect. Smoke might drift upward through a roof opening or simple chimney if one existed, but in many homes it lingered. It stung eyes, darkened rafters, settled into clothing, and filled the air with the smell of wood, peat, straw, or whatever fuel people could obtain. A warm medieval room was often smoky. A cleaner room was often colder. That is one of the quiet contradictions of the season. For ordinary people, fuel was not endless. Firewood had to be collected, cut, stored, carried, and protected from damp. In some regions, access to woodland was controlled by lords, local customs, or legal rights. Peasants might have limited permission to gather fallen branches, deadwood, or underbrush, while larger timber remained restricted. In areas where wood was scarce, people used peat, turf, straw, dried animal dung, or brushwood. Each fuel burned differently. Some produced more smoke. Some gave less heat. Some burned too quickly. Some were hard to dry. So even fire, the most basic symbol of comfort, had to be managed carefully. A household could not always keep a great blaze roaring. Often, the goal was simply to maintain enough heat for cooking and survival. Coals might be banked overnight, protected under ash so they could be revived in the morning. Letting the fire die completely could mean waking in a cold, dark room and struggling to restart warmth with numb fingers, damp kindling, and limited light. Morning in a medieval winter household was rarely gentle. Before sunrise, the interior would be dim, cold, and crowded. People slept close together not because it was charming, but because body heat mattered. Bedding varied widely, but ordinary families might sleep on straw mattresses, rough blankets, cloaks, animal skins, or layered textiles accumulated over years. Straw could harbor insects. Blankets could remain damp. Clothing might be worn to bed because removing it meant losing warmth. When people rose, they did not step into a heated house. They stepped into the same cold air they had slept inside, only now without the small refuge of shared bedding. The hearth needed attention. Animals might need feeding. Water might need to be fetched. Bread or porridge might need preparation. The day began not with comfort, but with tasks required to create the possibility of comfort. And outside, winter changed the village itself. Roads became uncertain. Mud, ice, snow, flooded paths, and frozen ruts made movement slower and more dangerous. Travel did not simply become unpleasant. It became expensive in time and risk. A journey to market could take longer. Cart could break. An animal could slip. A messenger could be delayed. A priest, midwife, healer, or neighbor might not arrive when needed. In a world where distance was measured by walking, weather could shrink life dramatically. This mattered because medieval communities were connected by obligation. People owed rents, labor, payments, services, and appearances at courts or markets. Winter did not always suspend these pressures. Complicated them. A lord still expected dues. A miller still took a share. A household still needed salt, tools, repairs, and sometimes credit. The season slowed the world, but it did not stop the systems that shaped ordinary life. Food was the great hidden anxiety beneath the cold. After harvest, there might be a brief sense of relief. Grain stored in barns or chests, ale brewed, animals slaughtered, fruit dried, vegetables stored, cheese made, meat salted or smoked if possible. But winter was also a long test of calculation. The question was not only whether there was food today. It was whether eating enough today would mean hunger later. Bread was central, but grain supplies could be fragile. A poor harvest, bad storage, rodents, mold, theft, taxation, rent obligations, or simple miscalculation could turn winter into a season of slow fear. People might stretch grain with pulses, oats, barley, rye, peas, beans, or whatever was regionally available. Pottage, a thick, flexible stew of grains, vegetables, legumes, herbs, and sometimes meat, became essential because it could be adjusted to scarcity, could be made thinner when supplies were low, could absorb leftovers, could feed many from little. This is one of the reasons medieval winter felt endless. Hunger was not always dramatic starvation. Sometimes it was repetition. The same coarse bread, the same thin pottage, the same salted meat if there was any, the same ale, because clean water was not always dependable and weak ale was a common everyday drink in many regions. The same careful measuring, the same knowledge that spring, though hopeful, did not immediately bring abundance. In fact, the end of winter could be more dangerous than the middle. This surprises many people. We imagine the hardest point as the coldest night. But for many medieval households, the most difficult stretch came in late winter and early spring, when stored food ran low, animals were lean, bodies were weakened, and new crops had not yet arrived. This period was sometimes called the hungry gap. It was the narrow bridge between surviving winter and reaching the next growing season. The sun might return, the days might lengthen, but the larder could still be nearly empty. Spring promised life, but it did not instantly feed anyone. That slow delay between hope and relief shaped the emotional texture of the medieval year. A person could see fields beginning to change and still feel hunger in the body. They could hear birds returning and still count the last measures of grain. They could feel warmer air and still know that illness, debt, and weakness had followed them out of winter. For ordinary people, winter also changed work rather than simply ending it. Agricultural labor slowed in some ways, but it did not disappear. Animals had to be tended. Tools had to be repaired. Fences, carts, baskets, harnesses, clothing, roofs, and household objects needed attention. Women's work in particular did not pause. Cooking, brewing, spinning, mending, child care, washing, tending fires, managing food, caring for the sick, and processing raw materials continued through cold and darkness. Spinning was especially important. The phrase distaffside, later associated with women, reflects how strongly textile work was connected to female labor. In winter, when fieldwork was reduced, households often turned toward indoor production. Wool, flax, hemp, and other fibers had to be processed into thread and cloth. This work was repetitive, skilled, and time-consuming. It could be done near the hearth in dim light, with fingers made stiff by cold. It is easy to romanticize this image. A family gathered by firelight, hands busy, stories moving softly through the room. And perhaps there were evenings like that. Medieval people laughed, sang, told stories, prayed, gossiped, taught children, and found comfort where they could. But the same scene also held fatigue. Smoke in the lungs, damp hems, children coughing, old people aching, pots stretched thin, a storm pressing against the roof, a mother listening to the wind and wondering how much grain remained. The medieval winter household was intimate because it had to be. Privacy was limited. Space was shared. Animals might be kept close, sometimes even inside or attached to the living area, depending on region and building type. This brought warmth and protection, but also smell, noise, parasites, and disease. The boundary between human and animal life was often much thinner than in modern homes. A cow, pig, goat, or chickens could represent food, wealth, survival, rent, and future security. Keeping animals alive through winter could be as important as keeping people warm. Yet feeding animals was costly. Hay, straw, oats, and stored fodder had limits. This is why autumn slaughter was a practical necessity. Not every animal could be carried through the winter. The famous feasting around late autumn and early winter was partly connected to this hard calculation. Meat might be more available after slaughter, but that did not mean abundance lasted. Fresh meat was temporary. Preserved meat required salt, smoke, skill, and storage. Poorer households could not always preserve much. So one of the hidden ironies of medieval winter is that moments of apparent plenty could be signs of constraint. A household might eat meat because it could not afford to feed the animal. A feast might sit close to fear. A full table in November did not guarantee a full belly in February. Religion gave structure to the season as well. The medieval calendar was filled with feast days, fasts, saints' days, and rituals that marked time when the natural world seemed suspended. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, Lent. These were not merely religious labels. They organized social life, memory, obligation, and expectation. They told people where they were in the darkness. The church offered warmth of another kind. Not always physical warmth, though stone churches could be bitterly cold, but a framework in which suffering had meaning. Winter hardship could be understood through sin, providence, endurance, charity, penance, and hope. Prayers for protection, blessings over fields, rituals around light, candles, and holy days all helped people live within uncertainty. But here again, we should be careful. It is too simple to say medieval people were comforted by faith and leave it there. Faith did not remove hunger. It did not keep every child alive. It did not make a poor cottage warm. But it gave language to fear, and in a world where many dangers could not be controlled, language mattered. Ritual mattered. Community mattered. A winter feast in a medieval village could therefore carry layers of meaning. It was social, religious, practical, and emotional all at once. People gathered not because life was easy, but because gathering helped them endure what life demanded. Songs, candles, ale, bread, shared food, church bells, and seasonal customs created islands of rhythm in a season that otherwise blurred into cold repetition. And yet, even celebration could reveal inequality. A lord's winter was not the same as a peasant's winter. In a manor house, castle, monastery, or wealthy urban home, there might be larger hearths, better stores, more servants, thicker walls, better clothing, more preserved food, imported spices, wine, candles, and access to enclosed spaces. But even elite comfort had limits by modern standards. Great halls could be drafty. Stone walls could hold cold. Castles were not always cozy. Smoke, damp, darkness, and disease still reached upward through society, though never evenly. For the poor, inequality could be felt in the body. Better wool meant warmth. Better shoes meant mobility. Better food meant resistance to illness. Better bedding meant sleep. Better access to fuel meant survival with less suffering. Medieval poverty was not only having less money, it was having less protection against the season. Clothing was one of the most important forms of protection. Wool was vital because it retained warmth better than many alternatives and could still insulate when damp. Linen underlayers, woolen tunics, cloaks, hoods, mittens, hose, and wrapped layers all helped create a barrier between body and weather. But clothing wore out. It tore, thinned, soaked, smelled, and needed mending. Shoes were especially precious. Wet feet could make work miserable and illness more likely. A poor pair of shoes in winter could change the meaning of every journey. Children felt winter differently. They were vulnerable to cold, hunger, and disease, but they were also part of the household economy. Older children helped carry fuel, tend animals, fetch water, watch younger siblings, spin, gather, and perform small tasks. Childhood in winter was not an idle season of indoor comfort. It was a training in endurance, work, and dependence on the household's fragile resources. For the elderly, winter could be frightening. Cold worsened pain. Poor nutrition weakened the body. Smoke irritated lungs. Slippery paths increased danger. A person who could work in summer might become dependent in winter. In a society where survival often relied on household productivity, weakness had consequences not only for the individual but for everyone around them. Illness moved easily through winter households. Crowded rooms, Poor ventilation, smoke exposure, damp bedding, limited diet, and close contact all helped sickness spread. Medieval medicine contained practical knowledge, inherited theories, herbal remedies, religious practices, and local traditions. Some treatments helped, some did not, but ordinary people often had little margin. A fever, cough, infection, or injury could become more serious when food was scarce and warmth was limited. The cold also changed time itself. In summer, long daylight stretched work across many hours. In winter, darkness arrived early and lingered late. Artificial light was expensive. Candles, rushlights, oil lamps, and hearthlight all had costs and limitations. Poor households could not simply brighten the evening at will. Darkness shaped what could be done, how long work could continue, and how people experienced the day. This made winter psychologically different. The nights were not just longer by the clock. They were heavier. A household might sit in dim firelight, hearing animals shift, wind move through cracks, rain strike thatch, or snow soften the outside world. Beyond the small circle of light, the room disappeared. Beyond the room, the village disappeared. Beyond the village, roads, fields, forests, and distant towns became harder to imagine. For sleep, this could be both restful and uneasy. Medieval sleep patterns varied, and historians have discussed evidence for segmented sleep in pre-modern Europe, where people might sleep in two phases with a waking period during the night. Whether this was universal or not, winter darkness certainly created long hours in which sleep, prayer, quiet work, anxiety, intimacy, and waiting could blend together. The night was not empty. It had texture. It had sounds. It had fears. Wolves, thieves, spirits, fire, illness, childbirth, storms, and simple cold all belonged to the imagination of winter. Some fears were practical. Others were spiritual or folkloric. But in a world with little artificial light, the boundary between known and unknown felt different. Darkness was not merely absence of light. It was a place where danger could hide, and where stories grew stronger. This is why winter storytelling mattered. Around the hearth, people shared tales that carried memory, warning, humor, belief, and social order. Stories helped pass time, but they also explained the world. They taught children what to fear, what to respect, what to laugh at, and what kind of behavior the community valued. A strange tale told in January might be entertainment, but it could also be a map of social wisdom. And still, outside the circle of the hearth, the season pressed on. Snow itself was not always the main enemy. In some regions, deep snow could insulate fields or make travel by sled easier. In others, the real misery came from cold rain, mud, damp, and wind. A wet winter could be worse than a clean frozen one. Mud swallowed paths, clothing stayed damp, stored grain risked mold, thatch leaked, animals suffered, feet rotted in bad footwear. Work became slow, dirty, and exhausting. This is another modern misconception. Medieval winter was not always a postcard of white fields and silent roofs. Very often it was brown, gray, wet, smoky, and foul-smelling. It was thawing manure, soaked straw, churned lanes, damp wool, and smoke trapped under low roofs. It was not only cold. It was contamination, discomfort, and the constant labor of keeping things usable. A village in winter might look still from a distance, but inside it was full of effort. Someone was mending a harness. Someone was grinding grain. Someone was checking a sick animal. Someone was carrying water in a frozen bucket. Someone was cutting kindling. Someone was scraping mud from a threshold. Someone was turning a piece of meat in smoke. Someone was listening to a child cough through the night. And beneath all of this was the question that made winter feel endless. How long until the world opens again? Not just warms, but opens. Because winter closed things. Closed roads. Closed fields. Closed daylight. Closed choices. It closed the distance a person could easily travel, the variety of food they could eat, the kinds of work they could do, and sometimes the confidence they had in the future. It pushed life inward, into houses, barns, churches, bodies, memories, and fears. Yet medieval people also knew that winter was part of a cycle. They did not expect constant comfort. They expected seasons to demand different forms of endurance. Their lives were organized around rhythms of scarcity and labor that modern industrial societies have partly hidden from view. That does not mean they accepted suffering passively. It means they understood survival as something negotiated with the year itself. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is that ordinary medieval people were not living inside a symbol. They were not scenery in someone else's romance. They were practical, observant, tired, hopeful, anxious, skilled, and deeply familiar with the materials of their world. They knew the smell of snow before it fell. They knew which wood smoked badly. They knew the sound of an animal in distress. They knew how much grain remained by touch and sight. They knew which neighbor might help, which lord might demand, which child needed feeding first. Their winter was endless because it was intimate. It entered the skin, the lungs, the stomach, the floor, the bedding, the calendar, the church bell, the animal stall, and the family's private worries. It was not a backdrop. It was a force that shaped behavior, belief, economy, and memory. And as we move deeper into this world, the next question becomes even more revealing. When the cold tightened around every household, how did medieval communities decide who would be helped, who would be blamed, and who might be left to face the winter almost alone? The answer depended on far more than personal kindness. In many medieval villages, survival during winter was woven into a dense web of obligations, expectations, customs, and relationships that had developed over generations. A household rarely existed entirely on its own. Even the poorest family occupied a place within a larger community structure, and during the hardest months of the year, those connections could become the difference between endurance and disaster. This did not mean medieval villages were places of perfect cooperation. They were not. Neighbors argued, families feuded, property disputes simmered for years, and local rivalries could outlast entire generations. Yet winter had a way of revealing how much people depended upon one another. Consider the simple problem of fuel. If a widow lacked sons old enough to gather firewood, she might depend upon relatives, neighbors, or local customary rites. If an elderly man could no longer chop timber, younger family members often became essential. In many communities, certain expectations existed regarding care for vulnerable members. These expectations varied widely from region to region, but the principle was familiar. People understood that anyone could eventually become the person who needed help. That understanding created a complicated balance between charity and self-interest. Helping a struggling household was often an act of compassion, but it could also be practical. If a neighbor lost their livestock entirely, who would assist with communal work in spring? If a family collapsed into starvation, who would maintain their fields? If disease spread through one household, how long before it reached another? The medieval village was not a collection of isolated individuals. It was a system of interconnected risks. Winter made those risks visible. At the same time, resources were finite. This created one of the most difficult moral realities of medieval life. A family might genuinely wish to help a neighbor while privately worrying that their own grain stores would not last until Easter. Generosity carried a cost. Every loaf shared was a loaf no longer available for one's own children. That tension appears repeatedly in medieval records. Church sermons praised charity. Religious teachings encouraged almsgiving. Monasteries distributed aid when possible. Wealthier households occasionally provided food, fuel, or shelter. Yet the reality on the ground was rarely simple. Acts of kindness existed alongside calculation, hesitation, and fear. A harsh winter could test not only physical endurance but social bonds. And when conditions became severe enough, another phenomenon began to appear: migration. Modern audiences often imagine medieval peasants as permanently rooted to one place. In reality, movement was more common than many assume. During difficult winters or following poor harvests, some people left villages in search of work, food, relatives, monasteries, towns, or opportunities elsewhere. Such journeys were dangerous. Travel in winter exposed people to cold, illness, robbery, and exhaustion. Roads might be little more than muddy tracks. Rivers could flood unexpectedly. Snowstorms could erase familiar landmarks. A traveler who misjudged the weather might find themselves stranded miles from shelter. Yet desperation often outweighed caution. The decision to leave home was rarely romantic. It usually reflected necessity. A young laborer whose family stores had run low might seek employment in a larger town. An orphan child might be sent to relatives. A widow might enter domestic service. A struggling family might temporarily separate in hopes that fewer mouths would stretch remaining supplies. These decisions reveal something important about medieval winter. It was not merely an environmental challenge. It was an economic challenge. The season exposed weaknesses that had accumulated throughout the year. A poor harvest months earlier could suddenly become a winter crisis. An unpaid debt could become a winter crisis. A lost animal could become a winter crisis. An illness suffered during autumn could become a winter crisis. Everything was connected. And because everything was connected, winter often magnified inequality. A wealthy merchant in a town might complain about high prices while still purchasing imported food. A lord might notice reduced rents while continuing to dine from well-stocked storerooms. Meanwhile, poorer households confronted choices that were far more immediate. Should grain be consumed now or saved? Should fuel be burned tonight or preserved for colder weather? Should an animal be slaughtered immediately or fed a little longer? Should scarce resources be spent treating illness or protecting livestock? Such decisions could shape the entire remainder of the season. This is one reason medieval people paid close attention to signs, patterns, and forecasts. They lacked modern meteorology, but they were not indifferent observers of weather. Farmers watched clouds, winds, birds, animal behavior, moisture levels, frost patterns, and seasonal timing with remarkable attention. Knowledge accumulated across generations. Some observations were practical and accurate. Others blended with folklore and local beliefs. A particular wind might be associated with coming storms. A certain bird's behavior might signal changing conditions. The timing of frost could inspire predictions about the months ahead. These traditions offered a sense of structure in a world filled with uncertainty. Whether entirely reliable or not was sometimes beside the point. People wanted clues. Winter encouraged anticipation. The unknown itself could become exhausting. Imagine living through January with no reliable sense of whether spring would arrive in 6 weeks or 12. Imagine wondering whether food would last. Imagine listening to every storm and calculating what it might mean for roads, livestock, roofs, and stored supplies. The psychological burden of uncertainty could be as significant as the physical burden of cold. For this reason, the medieval calendar carried unusual emotional weight. Certain feast days became markers of progress. People measured the season through religious observances, agricultural expectations, and familiar milestones. Christmas signaled one stage, Candlemas another, Lent another, The passing of each observance reassured communities that time was still moving forward. This may sound obvious to us, but in a world without electric light, modern entertainment, rapid transportation, or constant communication, seasonal time felt different. Winter could genuinely seem to stretch. Days repeated similar routines. Darkness arrived early. Work changed but did not disappear. The landscape altered little from week to week. Progress toward spring often felt frustratingly slow. And yet, beneath the apparent stillness, important changes were already underway. Seeds remained dormant beneath frozen ground. Animals carried unborn offspring. Stored materials awaited use. Plans for spring labor were quietly forming. The medieval world often appeared motionless during winter, but much of its future was being prepared in hidden ways. This hidden preparation extended beyond agriculture. Many trades used winter differently than summer. Craftsmen repaired tools. Carpenters shaped timber. Blacksmiths forged equipment. Weavers processed textiles. Leatherworkers prepared goods for future markets. Winter reduced some forms of labor while creating opportunities for others. A village might seem quieter from the outside while remaining surprisingly productive indoors. This creates another useful correction to a common assumption. Winter was not simply a season of inactivity. It was a season of different activity. The rhythm changed. The priorities changed. The pace changed. But life continued. Even warfare, which modern viewers often associate with spring and summer campaigns, did not disappear entirely. Large military operations frequently slowed because supply systems struggled in winter conditions. Roads deteriorated. Fodder became scarce. Armies consumed enormous quantities of food. Yet conflicts continued. Raids occurred. Fortresses remained occupied. Political decisions were made. Taxes were collected. Messengers traveled. Kings governed. The broader machinery of medieval society never fully stopped. This reality mattered because ordinary people could not simply retreat from the outside world. Winter might close roads, but obligations still arrived. Officials still demanded payments. Church authorities still expected observance. Lords still expected rents. Markets still influenced prices. The season narrowed possibilities, but it rarely suspended responsibility. And for many households, responsibility felt heavier during the cold months. Part of this burden came from illness. Winter sickness carried particular fears. Respiratory infections spread more easily among people living in crowded, smoky environments. Poor nutrition weakened resistance. Damp conditions aggravated existing ailments. Elderly individuals faced heightened risks. Infants remained especially vulnerable. Without modern medicine, outcomes could be unpredictable. A minor illness might pass quickly. A seemingly ordinary cough might become deadly. This uncertainty created a constant background tension. Families watched one another closely. Changes in appetite mattered. Changes in breathing mattered. Changes in energy mattered. In a season already associated with scarcity, sickness introduced another layer of vulnerability. And when illness struck during winter, treatment itself became more difficult. Traveling to seek help could be dangerous. Medicinal plants might be unavailable. Food needed for recovery might already be scarce. The body was forced to fight disease while also enduring cold. For medieval people, these realities were not unusual. They were familiar. That familiarity, however, should not be mistaken for acceptance. People worried. They grieved. They hoped. They prayed. The emotional lives of medieval individuals were every bit as complex as our own. A parent listening to a sick child during a winter night understood fear. A farmer watching dwindling supplies understood anxiety. An elderly woman facing another season of hardship understood uncertainty. The centuries separating us do not erase those emotions. In many ways, winter makes them easier to recognize, because cold has a remarkable ability to strip life down to essentials. Warmth, food, shelter, health, company, hope. These priorities remain surprisingly consistent across time. And perhaps nowhere was that more visible than during the long evenings when entire households gathered around the hearth. The fire became a center of conversation, work, memory, and observation. People exchanged news. They discussed weather. They shared local rumors. They repeated stories about previous winters. Older villagers compared current conditions to those they remembered from decades earlier. Children listened. Lessons were passed quietly from one generation to the next. Knowledge that might never be written down survived through these conversations. How to preserve food, how to recognize dangerous ice, how to predict changing weather, how to manage livestock, how to navigate difficult seasons. Winter became a classroom, not by design but by necessity. And as another stretch of dark evenings settled across the medieval landscape, households throughout Europe found themselves watching the same thing they had watched for centuries before them. The slow movement of the calendar toward the first unmistakable signs that winter's grip was finally beginning to loosen. The slow movement of the calendar toward the first unmistakable signs that winter's grip was finally beginning to loosen. Yet one of the most interesting realities of medieval life is that those signs often arrived long before winter was truly over. A modern person looking at a calendar can usually determine with precision when a season officially ends. Medieval people experienced the transition very differently. For them, winter and spring were not neat categories. They overlapped, argued with one another, and often seemed to take turns ruling the landscape. A mild afternoon in February could fill a village with cautious optimism. Snow might retreat from a hillside. Water could begin moving beneath thin ice. Birds might appear in greater numbers. The air might carry a faint softness absent for months. And then, just as suddenly, another hard freeze would arrive. The cold would return. Roads would become difficult again. Water would freeze once more. The promise of spring would seem to retreat beyond reach. This cycle of hope and disappointment was familiar across much of medieval Europe. It helps explain why ordinary people often spoke of winter not simply as a season, but almost as a test of patience. The waiting mattered. Every additional week of cold carried consequences. Food stores continued shrinking. Fuel piles continued diminishing. Animals consumed precious fodder. Clothing continued wearing down. The body accumulated fatigue. The difference between an early spring and a late spring could affect an entire year's fortunes. And this is where the medieval experience becomes particularly revealing. The greatest threat was not always dramatic catastrophe. It was uncertainty. A terrible blizzard was frightening. A destructive storm was frightening. But uncertainty could linger for months. A household might spend weeks wondering whether supplies would last, whether the weather would improve, whether prices would rise further, whether sickness would spread, whether spring planting could begin on time. Unlike many modern problems, these questions often had no immediate answer. People simply had to endure. The emotional skill of endurance was one of the most valuable abilities in medieval life. Not because medieval people were somehow tougher than modern people, but because their world demanded it more frequently. Waiting was unavoidable. Waiting for better weather. Waiting for roads to reopen. Waiting for relatives to arrive. Waiting for livestock to recover. Waiting for fields to dry. Waiting for markets to stabilize. Waiting for winter to finally release its hold. This patience shaped entire communities. It also influenced how medieval people thought about time itself. Modern society often encourages the expectation of rapid change. News changes hourly. Technology evolves constantly. Goods arrive within days or even hours. For an ordinary villager in the 13th or 14th century, meaningful change often moved at a very different pace. A season mattered. A harvest mattered. A year mattered. Generations mattered. The rhythm of life followed agricultural realities rather than mechanical schedules. Winter emphasized this slower rhythm. Days seemed repetitive, yet within that repetition, people remained highly attentive to subtle changes. The appearance of the first shoots in a field, the condition of lambs born late in the season, the behavior of migratory birds, the sound of water returning to streams, the condition of roads. These details carried enormous significance because they signaled the gradual reopening of possibilities. One particularly important indicator was the condition of the soil. For modern observers, soil can seem like a background feature. For medieval people, it was central to survival. The soil determined what could be planted, when planting could begin, how much labor would be required, and ultimately whether the coming year would provide security or hardship. As winter weakened, farmers carefully assessed the land. Too wet and plowing became difficult. Too frozen, and seeds could not be planted. Too dry and different problems emerged. Success depended on timing, and timing was never entirely under human control. This created a fascinating contradiction at the heart of medieval agriculture. People worked extraordinarily hard, yet some of the most important outcomes depended on forces beyond their command. No amount of effort could completely control weather. No amount of effort could guarantee rainfall. No amount of effort could prevent every frost. The medieval farmer lived with a level of environmental uncertainty that is difficult for many modern people to fully imagine. Winter highlighted that uncertainty more clearly than any other season. The entire village waited for signals from the natural world. And while they waited, daily life continued. Repair work often intensified during the final weeks of winter. Tools damaged during the previous year needed attention before spring labor began. Plow components required inspection. Harnesses needed mending. Cart wheels required maintenance. Fences damaged by storms had to be repaired. Storage containers needed checking. Every household understood that spring would bring an explosion of activity. Preparation done now could save valuable time later. This practical mindset reveals something important about medieval communities. They were not passive victims of the seasons. They adapted constantly. People planned. They improvised. They learned from experience. A farmer remembered which field drained fastest. A shepherd remembered which pasture became usable first. A householder remembered which section of roof leaked during the previous storm. Knowledge accumulated year after year. Winter became a season of memory as much as a season of endurance. Older villagers possessed valuable information. Experience mattered. An elderly farmer who had lived through 50 winters carried a mental archive unavailable anywhere else. He remembered harsh years, mild years, years of flooding, years of drought, years when spring arrived early, years when frost destroyed crops. In largely oral communities, such memories were practical resources. The wisdom of older generations helped younger families navigate uncertainty. Of course, memory was not perfect. People sometimes exaggerated. Stories grew larger with retelling. Particularly severe winters acquired almost legendary status. Certain storms became community reference points. Years later, people might still compare current conditions to memorable events from the past. Not since the winter when the river froze solid. Not since the year the sheep died. Not since the Great Storm. Such comparisons created a shared historical consciousness. Communities understood themselves partly through collective memories of survival. Winter hardships became stories. Stories became lessons. Lessons became traditions. and traditions shaped behavior. Some traditions focused on practical preparation. Others focused on religion. Others blended both. Throughout medieval Europe, seasonal customs reflected the deep connection between people and the annual cycle. Blessings of fields, prayers for favorable weather, processions, feast days, community gatherings. These activities were not separate from agricultural life. They were woven into it. Modern observers sometimes divide practical life from spiritual life more sharply than medieval people did. For many villagers, prayer and preparation existed side by side. One repaired the roof. One asked for divine protection. Neither action seemed contradictory. Both addressed uncertainty. This blend of practicality and faith became especially visible during periods of unusual weather. A late frost could trigger anxiety. A prolonged freeze could spark concern. Heavy rains might lead to speculation about what the coming months would bring. Communities interpreted events through multiple lenses simultaneously. Weather was physical. Weather was economic. Weather was social. Weather could also be spiritual. These overlapping interpretations helped people make sense of experiences that often felt beyond human control. Meanwhile, inside towns and cities, winter carried somewhat different challenges. Urban residents faced many of the same concerns regarding food, fuel, and illness, but density introduced additional complications. Streets could become filthy during thaw periods. Waste accumulated. Water supplies could become contaminated. Fires posed constant dangers. Crowded living conditions allowed disease to spread efficiently. Urban winters were not necessarily easier than rural ones. They were simply different. In some respects, towns offered advantages. Markets provided access to goods. Specialized trades created economic opportunities. Charitable institutions sometimes provided assistance. Religious houses occasionally distributed aid. Yet cities also concentrated vulnerability. When prices rose sharply, large populations felt the effects simultaneously. Food shortages could become politically sensitive. Local authorities watched such developments carefully. Maintaining order mattered, because winter did not merely challenge households. It challenged systems. A kingdom's stability depended on countless local communities successfully enduring difficult seasons. Tax collection relied upon functioning agriculture. Trade relied upon usable routes. Military power relied upon productive populations. Winter touched every layer of society. The peasant worried about grain. The merchant worried about prices. The lord worried about revenues. The bishop worried about charity. The king worried about the broader condition of the realm. Everyone experienced winter differently, yet everyone experienced it. This shared exposure to seasonal forces created a rare point of connection across social classes. Even the wealthy could not completely escape darkness, cold, illness, or uncertainty. They could mitigate them, they could soften them, but they could not eliminate them. And sometimes nature reminded everyone of that fact. Particularly severe winters occasionally became major historical events in their own right. Rivers froze, harvest schedules shifted, trade routes collapsed, livestock losses increased, prices climbed, entire regions struggled. These episodes entered chronicles because they disrupted normal expectations. They reminded people that beneath all human institutions remained an environment capable of imposing its own rules. Yet most winters were not remembered by chroniclers. Most winters passed quietly. No dramatic disaster, no famous storm, no great famine. Simply months of effort, months of cold mornings, months of careful calculation, months of routine endurance. And in some ways, these ordinary winters tell us more about medieval life than the extraordinary ones. because they reveal what daily existence actually felt like for most people. Not constant catastrophe, not endless suffering, but persistent challenge, persistent uncertainty, persistent labor, survival built from countless small decisions. A piece of firewood saved, a garment repaired, a roof patched, a meal stretched, a favor exchanged, a risk avoided, a task completed before darkness fell. These small actions rarely appear in famous historical records, yet they formed the foundation upon which medieval society rested. Kings could issue decrees, lords could hold land, monasteries could preserve knowledge, armies could wage war. None of it functioned without ordinary households surviving the winter. And as the season slowly advanced toward spring, another set of challenges began approaching. Because the arrival of warmer weather did not mean rest. Quite the opposite. The moment winter loosened its grip, medieval communities faced one of the most demanding transitions of the entire year. Fields had to be prepared. Animals needed managing. Tools returned to constant use. Roads reopened. Markets became busier. Agricultural labor accelerated dramatically. The season of waiting was giving way to the season of action. And across villages, towns, manors, and monasteries alike, people began watching for the same unmistakable signal. The first stretch of days when the ground remained soft enough, long enough, for the work of spring to truly begin. The first stretch of days when the ground remained soft enough, long enough, for the work of spring to truly begin. For medieval people, that moment was not merely a sign of changing weather. It was a release of pressure that had been building for months. Yet there was an irony hidden within this long-awaited transition. Spring brought relief, but it also brought urgency. The winter months had constrained movement, reduced agricultural activity, and forced much of life inward. Once conditions improved, there was suddenly more work than time. Every household understood that opportunities missed in spring could echo through the entire year. Fields needed attention immediately. Livestock demanded care. Repairs that had been postponed now became unavoidable. Travel resumed. Markets became active. Communal obligations returned in full force. The season that ended winter's monotony often began one of the busiest periods in the medieval calendar. This helps explain why memories of winter were rarely simple. People longed for spring, but they also knew what spring required. The return of warmth did not mean comfort. It meant responsibility. A farmer standing in a muddy field during early March might feel relief that winter was weakening, but he would also see weeks of labor waiting ahead. Plowing, sowing, fencing, repairing, transporting, preparing. Everything seemed to demand attention at once. And after months of relative confinement, the landscape itself felt transformed. Roads that had been nearly impassable began carrying traffic again. Travelers reappeared. Merchants returned to routes abandoned during the worst weather. Communication increased. News spread more easily. Villages that had felt isolated during winter became connected once more to the wider world. This reopening of movement was profoundly important. Medieval society depended upon circulation. Goods moved. Information moved. People moved. Religious pilgrims traveled. Traders negotiated. Officials carried instructions. Craftsmen sought opportunities. The economy breathed more freely when roads became usable. During winter, that circulation had narrowed. Now it expanded again. Yet the roads themselves often revealed winter's legacy. Thawing conditions could create enormous difficulties. Mud became one of the defining features of the season. Modern people sometimes imagine historical transportation primarily in terms of snow and ice, but many medieval travelers dreaded mud just as much. Deep mud slowed carts, exhausted animals, damaged wheels, increased travel times dramatically. A journey that seemed straightforward on a map could become a frustrating struggle through churned earth. Entire roads sometimes deteriorated into difficult channels of sticky, waterlogged ground. Travelers frequently complained about such conditions. Merchants calculated losses. Villagers organized repairs where possible. Local authorities occasionally required labor to maintain roads and bridges. The return of mobility was therefore gradual rather than immediate. Winter loosened its grip slowly. The same was true inside the household. Consider the condition of clothing after a long winter. Wool garments had endured months of use. Shoes had encountered mud, snow, moisture, and rough conditions. Blankets showed wear. Storage containers needed cleaning. Roofs required inspection. Furniture might need repair. Many households emerged from winter with a long list of accumulated maintenance problems. Medieval life involved constant repair. This is another detail that modern audiences sometimes underestimate. Objects were valuable. Clothing was valuable. Tools were valuable. Household goods were valuable. Replacing things was often expensive or impossible. As a result, maintenance occupied a significant portion of daily life. Winter accelerated wear. Spring exposed it. A damaged plow discovered during planting season could become a serious problem. A weakened harness could delay work. A leaking roof might require immediate attention before spring rains intensified. Survival depended not only upon acquiring resources but preserving them. The medieval household functioned partly as a repair workshop. Skills that seem specialized today were often everyday necessities. Sewing, leatherworking, woodworking, rope-making, basic construction, tool maintenance. These abilities reduced dependence on outside assistance. They increased resilience. And resilience mattered enormously in a world where unexpected setbacks could threaten an entire household's security. This practical self-sufficiency appeared everywhere in medieval life. Yet it coexisted with dependence. No family was entirely self-contained. Communities relied upon specialists. Blacksmiths remained essential. Millers remained essential. Carpenters, masons, merchants, clergy, and countless others contributed to the functioning of local society. Spring highlighted these connections. Activity increased. Exchange increased. Interaction increased. Winter isolation gradually gave way to communal engagement. The village became louder. More people moved outdoors. Agricultural work created opportunities for cooperation. Shared labor arrangements became important. Neighbors helped one another. Families coordinated efforts. Certain tasks benefited from many hands working together. Medieval communities were often competitive, but they were also collaborative when circumstances required it. The demands of the agricultural year encouraged cooperation. No household existed entirely outside that reality. And while fields captured much attention, animals remained equally important. Winter had tested livestock severely. Fodder supplies had been consumed steadily. Disease sometimes spread through confined conditions. Weaker animals might have died. Surviving animals emerged from winter in varying states of health. Their condition influenced everything that followed. Oxen needed strength for plowing. Sheep provided wool. Cows provided milk. Horses supported transportation and labor. Pigs represented future food supplies. Animals were not secondary assets. They were central economic resources. A healthy ox team could significantly improve agricultural productivity. A weak or injured animal could create serious difficulties. This is one reason medieval people devoted so much attention to livestock care. Winter losses could reshape household fortunes. Spring revealed the results. Every surviving animal represented both relief and responsibility. Feeding requirements changed. Grazing opportunities expanded. Young animals arrived. Breeding cycles continued. New risks emerged. The agricultural year advanced. Yet perhaps the most emotionally significant change involved light. After months of darkness, lengthening days altered daily experience in subtle but important ways. More daylight meant more working hours, more visibility, more flexibility, more opportunities. Medieval people noticed these changes intensely because light directly affected daily routines. Artificial illumination remained limited and expensive. Natural daylight remained the most valuable resource. The return of longer evenings therefore carried practical significance. Tasks that had been difficult during winter became easier. Work could continue later. Travel became safer. Social interactions expanded. The psychological effects were equally important. Darkness influences mood. It always has. Medieval people may not have described this phenomenon using modern terminology, but they experienced it. Long winters could feel restrictive. The return of light felt liberating. Even simple activities changed character. Fetching water, walking between villages, tending livestock, gathering materials, all became easier with additional daylight. The landscape itself seemed larger. Possibilities expanded. And yet, despite these improvements, medieval people remained cautious. Experience had taught them that spring could be deceptive. Late frosts remained dangerous. Sudden storms remained possible. Flooding could occur. Crop failures could still happen. Optimism was often tempered by realism. This balance between hope and caution appears repeatedly throughout medieval sources. People celebrated improvement, but they remembered previous disappointments. They understood that nature rarely followed human expectations perfectly. In some years, this caution proved wise. A late freeze could damage early growth. Excessive rainfall could delay planting. Livestock disease could spread unexpectedly. Even after surviving winter, communities remained vulnerable. This vulnerability shaped medieval attitudes toward fortune. Success was never assumed. Good outcomes were appreciated precisely because they could not be guaranteed. Modern societies often take stability for granted. Medieval societies generally could not. Every successful harvest represented achievement. Every healthy season represented relief. Every avoided disaster represented good fortune. Winter reminded people of these realities annually. It renewed awareness of dependence upon forces larger than individual effort. Yet it also highlighted human adaptability. Communities survived because they learned, because they cooperated, because they prepared, because they remembered. The medieval world was not static. Knowledge evolved continuously. Farmers refined techniques. Craftsmen improved skills. Villages adjusted practices. Generations accumulated experience. Winter hardships contributed to that learning process. Lessons paid for through difficulty tended to be remembered. A failed storage method, poorly timed planting, an inadequate fuel supply. Such mistakes often became valuable knowledge for future years. This practical accumulation of experience formed a quiet but important part of medieval resilience. Not every lesson appeared in written records. Most existed within families, within villages, within conversations, within habits passed from parent to child. The transmission of knowledge was often informal, but it was no less significant. A grandmother teaching preservation methods, a father explaining weather signs, a shepherd describing grazing patterns, a carpenter demonstrating repairs. These ordinary acts preserved community memory. Winter, with its slower pace and longer evenings, often provided opportunities for such teaching. Spring revealed how well those lessons had been learned. And as fields gradually filled with renewed activity, another reality became increasingly visible. The medieval year was not divided neatly into separate seasons. Instead, each season carried traces of the previous one. Winter influenced spring. Spring shaped summer. Summer determined autumn. Autumn prepared for winter. Everything connected. A shortage of firewood collected in autumn might create hardship months later. A delayed spring planting could affect harvest quality. A poor harvest could transform the next winter. Cause and effect stretched across the entire calendar. Medieval people understood this instinctively because they lived within those cycles. The seasons were not background scenery. They were active participants in daily life. Few seasons demonstrated this more clearly than winter. It demanded preparation before it arrived, endurance while it lasted, recovery after it passed. Its influence extended far beyond cold weather alone. And perhaps this is why medieval winters felt so long to ordinary people. Not merely because temperatures were low, not merely because daylight was limited, but because winter touched every part of life simultaneously. Food, work, travel, health, family, community, economy, religion, memory, hope. The season reached into all of them, and even now, as the first serious work of spring began unfolding across medieval Europe, the consequences of the winter just endured remained visible everywhere. From the condition of livestock and grain stores to the choices households would make as they entered another uncertain agricultural year, the consequences of the winter just endured remained visible everywhere. From the condition of livestock and grain stores to the choices households would make as they entered another uncertain agricultural year. And perhaps nowhere were those consequences more visible than in the medieval diet. When modern people imagine historical food, they often picture abundance or scarcity in simple terms. Either a feast overflowing with roasted meats and fresh bread, or a starving peasant with almost nothing to eat. The reality was usually more subtle, and winter played a major role in shaping that reality. By the time spring finally arrived, many households had spent months drawing down supplies that had been gathered the previous year. The contents of a family's storage chest told a story. Every sack of grain represented labor performed many months earlier. Every preserved vegetable reflected careful preparation. Every surviving wheel of cheese represented successful management of livestock. Every remaining piece of smoked or salted meat reflected decisions made before winter even began. The medieval household was, in many ways, a long-term planning project. Winter exposed whether that planning had succeeded. A household that emerged from winter with reasonable stores remaining could approach spring with confidence. Not certainty, but confidence. A household whose supplies were nearly exhausted faced a very different reality. This difference could often be measured in energy. Nutrition affected everything. A person who ate adequately worked more effectively. They resisted illness better. They recovered from injury more quickly. They could endure longer hours in the field. Their animals often received better care. Their children had greater chances of surviving difficult years. The effects accumulated quietly. And because they accumulated quietly, medieval inequality often appeared in forms that modern observers might overlook. A wealthy lord's winter feast was visible. A merchant's expensive imported spices were visible. But many inequalities were far less dramatic. A slightly warmer cloak, a somewhat stronger ox, a few additional sacks of grain, a roof in better condition, a healthier horse, a larger supply of firewood. These advantages might seem small individually. Over the course of a winter, however, they could become significant. By spring, two neighboring households might occupy very different positions despite appearing similar at the beginning of the cold season. One family could be entering spring relatively strong. The other could already be struggling. This gradual divergence helps explain why medieval communities paid such close attention to harvests. A good harvest did not simply mean more food. It meant resilience. It meant options. It meant protection against the unknown. Winter constantly reminded people of the value of surplus. Surplus represented security. Yet surplus was difficult to create. Agricultural production remained vulnerable to countless variables. Weather, disease, labor availability, animal health, soil quality, political instability, market conditions. The medieval farmer operated within a web of uncertainties that could never be entirely controlled. Winter transformed those uncertainties into visible outcomes. And because food mattered so deeply, medieval people spent considerable effort trying to understand why some years proved easier than others. Their explanations varied. Some emphasized practical causes. Others emphasized divine will. Many combined both. A failed harvest might be discussed in terms of weather patterns, soil conditions, and spiritual concerns simultaneously. To modern ears, this may sound contradictory. To medieval people, it often seemed perfectly reasonable. Human beings naturally seek explanations for hardship. Winter encouraged reflection. Long evenings provided opportunities for discussion. Why had supplies run low? Why had livestock suffered? Why had one household prospered while another struggled? These conversations helped communities interpret experience. Sometimes they produced useful insights. Sometimes they reinforced existing beliefs. Sometimes they created stories that survived for generations. Winter, therefore, shaped not only material conditions but memory itself. Certain years became reference points. The winter of deep snow, the winter of flooding, the winter when wolves came unusually close to settlements, the winter when grain prices doubled, the winter when disease spread through the village. Such events entered local history, and local history mattered. Medieval people often understood the world through direct experience and inherited memory rather than abstract statistics. A community's understanding of risk came from what it remembered. This influenced behavior. If a devastating winter had occurred within living memory, preparations might become more cautious. Additional firewood might be gathered. More grain might be stored if possible. Repairs might receive greater attention. Collective memory could shape practical action. In this way, winter functioned as a teacher. Not a gentle teacher, perhaps, but an effective one. Communities that survived difficult seasons often emerged with new knowledge. They adapted. They adjusted. They remembered. Yet adaptation had limits. There were some challenges no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. One of these was disease among animals. Livestock represented a form of stored wealth. They supplied labor, food, clothing materials, transport, and future income. Their health mattered enormously. Winter conditions frequently placed animals under stress. Limited fodder reduced nutrition. Crowded shelter increased disease transmission. Severe weather weakened already vulnerable animals. By spring, households often knew precisely how successful their winter management had been. The loss of even one valuable animal could alter a family's prospects. An ox might represent plowing power. A cow might represent milk production. Sheep supplied wool. Horses facilitated transportation. Each loss carried consequences beyond the immediate moment. This created another hidden layer of anxiety throughout winter. People were not only protecting themselves, they were protecting the resources upon which future survival depended. A sick animal demanded attention. A weak animal demanded attention. An injured animal demanded attention. The medieval household was constantly balancing present needs against future needs. Burn more fuel now or save it for later. Consume more food now or preserve supplies. work an animal harder, or conserve its strength. These decisions rarely had perfect answers. They involved judgment, experience, risk, and sometimes luck. Modern life often obscures how frequently historical survival depended upon probabilistic thinking. Medieval people did not use that terminology, of course, but they understood uncertainty intimately. Every decision involved weighing possibilities. Every season contained risks. Winter simply concentrated those risks. This concentration helps explain why winter occupied such a powerful place in folklore and imagination. Stories about winter often contained deeper themes than weather alone. They explored endurance, patience, resourcefulness, fortune, vulnerability, community. The season became a symbol because it already held practical importance. And symbols influence culture. Throughout medieval Europe, songs, legends, customs, and seasonal traditions reflected winter's emotional weight. Some emphasized danger, others emphasized hope, others focused on survival itself. These traditions varied enormously across regions, languages, and social groups, yet they shared common concerns: darkness, scarcity, waiting, renewal. Human beings repeatedly returned to these themes because they reflected lived experience. Winter was not merely observed. It was felt, deeply, repeatedly, across generations. This emotional dimension becomes especially clear when we consider childhood. For a medieval child, winter could seem endless in a very literal sense. Children experience time differently. A single season occupies a larger proportion of remembered life. A winter lasting several months could feel immense. Young children depended heavily upon adults for protection from cold, hunger, and illness. Their understanding of the season developed through observation. They watched parents manage supplies. They listened to conversations around the hearth. They noticed worry even when adults attempted to conceal it. At the same time, winter also offered opportunities for learning. Skills were taught. Stories were shared. Traditions were passed down. A child sitting near a fire while listening to older relatives discuss previous winters was receiving an informal education. Knowledge moved between generations continuously. This transfer of experience was one reason communities remained resilient despite repeated hardship. Wisdom accumulated, not perfectly, not uniformly, but effectively enough to sustain society over long periods. The elderly played an especially important role in this process. Their memories extended beyond the immediate year. They remembered patterns, comparisons, exceptions. They could place current events within a larger context. A younger person might see a harsh winter as unprecedented. An older person might remember 3 similar winters. This broader perspective often carried practical value, could reduce panic, encourage preparation, or simply remind people that difficult seasons eventually passed. Yet old age also carried vulnerabilities. Winter exposed them relentlessly. Arthritic joints worsened. Mobility declined. Illness became more dangerous. Recovery slowed. For elderly individuals living near the margins of subsistence, winter could be particularly threatening. Communities responded in different ways. Some provided support. Families often absorbed responsibility. Religious institutions occasionally offered assistance. But resources remained limited. Medieval society possessed compassion, yet compassion operated within constraints. This tension between care and scarcity appears throughout the historical record. People wanted to help. They could not always afford to help as much as they wished. Such realities were rarely comfortable. Winter forced communities to confront them directly. And perhaps this is one reason why medieval charity often intensified during colder months. The need was visible. Hunger became visible. Cold became visible. Vulnerability became visible. Responding to those needs became both a moral and social concern. Yet charity alone could not eliminate hardship. The underlying realities remained. Weather still mattered. Harvest still mattered. Disease still mattered. Economic conditions still mattered. Medieval life was shaped by systems larger than any individual household. Winter revealed those systems with unusual clarity. Connected distant events. A poor harvest in one region could influence prices elsewhere. A conflict disrupting trade could affect supplies. Unusual weather patterns could influence entire kingdoms. Even relatively isolated villages existed within broader networks. They felt the consequences whether they fully understood the causes or not. This interconnectedness is easy to overlook when imagining medieval life. We often picture villages as self-contained worlds. In reality, they were connected through trade, religion, politics, obligations, and movement. Winter affected those networks. Sometimes it strengthened local dependence. Sometimes it exposed wider vulnerabilities. And as spring advanced further, people gradually shifted their attention away from the hardships behind them and toward the opportunities ahead. Fields began changing color. Rivers flowed more freely. Animals moved onto fresh grazing land. Roads improved. Markets became busier. New concerns replaced old ones. Yet winter was never entirely forgotten. Its lessons lingered. Its consequences lingered. Its memory lingered. Every decision made during the coming months would, in some way, be influenced by what had happened during the season just past. And as medieval households committed themselves once more to the demanding work of cultivating the land, they entered a period that would determine whether the next winter would feel manageable, or whether another long season of uncertainty was already beginning to take shape beneath the warming skies. Another long season of uncertainty was already beginning to take shape beneath the warming skies. This may seem like a contradiction. After all, winter had finally loosened its hold. The days were longer. The fields were awakening. Livestock were moving back onto pasture. Roads were reopening. Villages felt alive again. Yet for medieval people, uncertainty did not disappear with the snow. It simply changed form. The winter months were dominated by a single question. Would supplies last? The spring months introduced a different question. Would the coming harvest succeed? Everything now depended upon the answer. A medieval household could survive a difficult winter if previous harvests had been strong. Could recover from illness if food remained available. It could repair damaged buildings if resources existed. But if the agricultural year failed, all of those possibilities narrowed. The entire cycle would begin again under worse conditions. This is why spring labor carried such urgency. To a modern observer, plowing a field may seem routine. To a medieval farmer, it was one of the most important acts of the year. The soil represented possibility. Every furrow cut into the earth was an investment in the future. Every seed placed into the ground carried hope. Not certainty. Hope. The distinction mattered. Medieval people understood better than most that effort and outcome were not always connected. A family could work tirelessly and still encounter drought. They could prepare carefully and still face floods. They could make all the correct decisions and still lose crops to disease. This reality created a mindset that modern societies sometimes struggle to appreciate. People valued hard work intensely, but they also understood that hard work alone could not control nature. Winter had taught that lesson repeatedly. Now spring reinforced it. A farmer walking behind an ox-drawn plow might spend hours staring at the same field, yet his thoughts often stretched far into the future. Would rainfall arrive at the right time? Would the seed germinate properly? Would livestock remain healthy? Would the summer bring storms? Would prices remain stable? Would there be enough food next winter? These questions followed agricultural communities constantly. The field beneath his feet was only one part of a much larger calculation. And because so much depended upon successful planting, spring often became one of the busiest periods of the year. Entire households participated. Men, women, children, servants, laborers, and neighbors all contributed in different ways. The medieval household was an economic unit as much as a family unit. Everyone's labor mattered. Children scared birds away from newly planted fields. Women worked in gardens, cared for livestock, prepared food, managed household tasks, and participated in countless seasonal activities depending upon region and circumstance. Older family members offered knowledge and supervision. The image of medieval agriculture as the work of isolated male farmers misses much of the reality. Agricultural success depended upon coordinated effort, and coordinated effort required organization. This is another hidden reason winter could feel endless. During the cold months, many of these activities slowed or shifted indoors. Now they returned all at once. The pace of life accelerated. People woke early, worked long hours, took advantage of daylight, responded quickly to changing weather. The village that had seemed quiet in January could feel entirely different by April. Sounds returned. The creaking of carts, the calls of laborers, the movement of livestock, the ringing of church bells across active fields, the steady rhythm of tools striking wood and earth. Spring was not merely visible, it was audible, and it carried a kind of cautious optimism. Not because medieval people expected guaranteed success, but because spring represented possibility. Possibility had been scarce during winter. Winter was largely about preserving what already existed. Spring was about creating what might exist. This shift in perspective affected emotional life as well. Human beings naturally respond to cycles of confinement and expansion. After months spent close to hearths and inside crowded structures, the ability to spend longer periods outdoors mattered psychologically. The landscape itself seemed larger. Distances felt shorter. Movement became easier. Social interaction increased. Markets became more crowded. Religious festivals became more active. Travel resumed. The world opened. Yet the memory of winter remained surprisingly close. A family that had nearly exhausted its grain stores would not easily forget the experience. Someone who had lost livestock would remember. Someone who had buried a relative during the cold months would remember. The arrival of spring did not erase hardship. It simply placed that hardship within a larger cycle. And this cycle was deeply familiar. Many medieval people measured life through repeated seasons rather than precise years. One winter resembled another. One harvest followed another. One spring planting echoed countless earlier plantings. The repetition created continuity, yet no year was identical. Every season brought differences, different weather, different prices, different illnesses, different fortunes. This combination of familiarity and uncertainty shaped medieval consciousness in subtle ways. Life felt cyclical, but never predictable, and nowhere was this more evident than in the relationship between weather and expectation. Modern forecasting allows us to anticipate conditions days or even weeks in advance with considerable accuracy. Medieval people possessed no such system. They observed, they interpreted, they guessed. Sometimes they guessed well. Sometimes they guessed poorly. The sky remained an open question. A cloudy horizon could inspire concern, a dry spell could inspire anxiety. An unusually warm period might seem promising or worrying. Every weather pattern invited interpretation. Farmers became skilled observers because observation mattered, not because it guaranteed success, but because it improved their chances. Knowledge provided an advantage, even when certainty remained impossible. This practical relationship with nature produced a worldview that was often more attentive than romantic. Modern culture sometimes imagines medieval people living in harmony with nature, as though they experienced the landscape through constant wonder. The reality was more complicated. People certainly appreciated beauty. They noticed seasons. They valued fertile land. But they also viewed nature as something that could threaten survival. A storm was not merely dramatic scenery, could destroy crops. A flood was not picturesque, could ruin livelihoods. Winter itself was a perfect example. Today, many people admire snow from heated homes. For medieval families, snow could represent transportation difficulties, livestock problems, food shortages, or delayed planting. Context changes perception, and this helps explain why ordinary medieval people often viewed weather through a practical lens. Nature was beautiful. Nature was useful. Nature was dangerous. All three could be true simultaneously. The arrival of spring therefore brought mixed emotions: excitement, relief, hope, concern, responsibility, anticipation. Each feeling existed alongside the others. A farmer might feel grateful to see new growth while simultaneously worrying about rainfall. A shepherd might celebrate healthy lambs while fearing disease. A merchant might welcome improved roads while worrying about competition and prices. Medieval life rarely offered pure optimism. Experience encouraged caution. And yet, despite this caution, spring remained deeply significant, because it represented renewal not just for fields but for entire communities. Trade increased. Construction projects resumed. Local courts became more active. Religious events attracted larger gatherings. Seasonal labor opportunities expanded. Economic activity intensified. The social world became busier. Winter had compressed life inward. Spring pushed it outward again. This pattern repeated year after year across much of Europe. And because it repeated so consistently, people organized expectations around it. The medieval calendar was not simply a way of measuring time. It was a way of preparing for predictable transitions. Everyone knew winter would return eventually. Everyone knew preparations would be required. Everyone knew the current season was laying the foundation for the next one. This awareness encouraged long-term thinking. A family gathering firewood in autumn was already preparing for winter. A farmer planting in spring was already preparing for autumn. A shepherd managing livestock in summer was already thinking about colder months ahead. Cause and effect stretched across the entire year. Medieval people lived inside those connections. They could not ignore them. And perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of this system is how much knowledge it required. The stereotype of medieval peasants as uneducated often obscures a crucial fact. They possessed extensive practical expertise. They understood weather patterns, soil behavior, animal care, preservation techniques, construction methods, seasonal timing, and local geography in extraordinary detail. Their knowledge was rarely formalized in books. Much of it was experiential, yet it was real knowledge nonetheless. Survival depended upon it. Winter especially rewarded competence. Knowing how to preserve food mattered. Knowing how to store grain mattered. Knowing how to repair structures mattered. Knowing how to manage fuel mattered. These skills accumulated across generations. And because they accumulated gradually, medieval society developed forms of resilience that are easy to overlook from a modern perspective. The average villager could perform tasks that many modern people no longer need to learn. They repaired, preserved, built, maintained, adapted. Their lives required versatility. Winter exposed weaknesses in that versatility. Spring rewarded strengths. Every year became a test. Not a dramatic test conducted once, but a continuous series of smaller tests spread across months. Could the household store enough food? Could the roof survive storms? Could livestock remain healthy? Could fields produce adequately? Could resources be managed wisely? These questions defined everyday existence. And because they defined everyday existence, they shaped social values. Prudence became important. Reliability became important. Hard work became important. Community reputation became important. A person known for wastefulness might struggle to receive help during difficult periods. A family known for cooperation often possessed stronger social support. Relationships functioned as resources. Winter revealed their value. People remembered who shared food, who offered assistance, who honored obligations, who failed to do so. Communities carried long memories. Seasonal hardship often strengthened those memories. And as the spring landscape continued changing, green gradually replacing brown, birds returning in greater numbers, streams running fuller with melted snow, the work of preparing for the future accelerated. Fields that had seemed dormant only weeks earlier now demanded constant attention. Seeds entered the soil. Livestock expanded grazing ranges. Markets filled with seasonal activity. Roads carried increasing numbers of travelers. The world that winter had narrowed was widening once again. Yet beneath this growing movement lingered a truth every experienced medieval household understood. The next winter was already coming. Not tomorrow, not soon, but inevitably. And every decision being made in the fields, workshops, barns, gardens, and marketplaces of spring would eventually help determine what that future winter would feel like when darkness returned and the long cycle began once more. For now, however, the attention of medieval Europe remained fixed on the growing season ahead, and on the fragile green shoots emerging from the earth, small signs that would soon reveal whether the hardships of the past winter had been endured in vain or whether they had purchased another year of survival. Those fragile green shoots carried more significance than their appearance suggested. To modern eyes, the first growth of spring can seem symbolic, almost decorative. For ordinary medieval people, it was practical evidence. It was one of the earliest indications that the immense gamble of the agricultural year was underway once again. And it truly was a gamble. Not in the sense of recklessness, but in the sense that outcomes remained uncertain no matter how carefully people prepared. A farmer could inspect a field and see promise. He could also see risk. The same field that offered nourishment might later suffer from excessive rain. Birds might consume newly planted seed. Livestock could damage crops. Disease might spread. Summer storms could flatten grain. A drought could arrive unexpectedly. The medieval world rewarded planning but never guaranteed results. That uncertainty helps explain something curious about winter itself. Although winter was often remembered as the hardest season, many of the fears associated with it were actually fears about the future. A family sitting beside the hearth in January was not only worried about surviving January. They were worried about what would happen months later. Would there be enough seed to plant? Would animals survive until grazing improved? Would debts become unmanageable? Would the next harvest compensate for current sacrifices? Winter forced people to think ahead. The season narrowed immediate possibilities while expanding long-term concerns. In that sense, medieval winter was as much a mental experience as a physical one. The cold entered people's calculations. It shaped decisions. It influenced expectations. It altered plans. Long after the snow disappeared, its effects continued. This became particularly visible in the management of grain. Grain was not simply food. It occupied several roles simultaneously. It fed households. It supplied seed for future planting. It served as rent. It functioned as a commodity for exchange. It supported livestock. It represented security. Every sack of grain contained multiple futures. This created difficult choices. A hungry household might be tempted to consume grain intended for planting. Doing so could relieve immediate suffering, but it might create larger problems later. The tension between present needs and future needs was one of the defining realities of medieval life. Winter sharpened that tension. The hungry months near the end of winter were especially dangerous because people often faced these competing demands simultaneously. The body demanded food now. The future demanded restraint. There were rarely easy answers. And because these decisions were so important, communities often developed customs, expectations, and systems intended to reduce risk. Some villages maintained communal arrangements. Some regions relied heavily on extended family networks. Some households diversified crops when possible. Others accumulated reserves whenever circumstances allowed. None of these measures eliminated uncertainty. They simply improved the odds. The medieval world was filled with efforts to improve the odds. This is an important point because popular portrayals sometimes make medieval life appear passive, as though ordinary people simply accepted whatever happened. The historical reality was far more active. People planned constantly. They adjusted constantly. They responded to changing conditions with considerable intelligence. Their options were limited, but they were rarely passive. Winter preparation alone required substantial foresight. Wood had to be gathered months in advance. Food had to be preserved. Buildings had to be maintained. Animals had to be managed carefully. Clothing needed repair. Every successful winter represented countless decisions made long before cold weather arrived. In fact, one of the most revealing aspects of medieval winter is how much work occurred before winter even began. A comfortable winter was often the result of a successful autumn. A successful autumn was often the result of a successful summer. A successful summer depended upon decisions made during spring. Everything connected. The seasons formed a chain. A weak link anywhere along that chain could create difficulties later. Medieval people understood this intuitively because they lived inside the system. They experienced consequences unfolding across months rather than days. This encouraged a different relationship with time. Modern life often emphasizes immediate outcomes. Medieval life frequently emphasized delayed outcomes. Actions taken now might not reveal their importance until much later. A repaired roof might prove valuable during a storm months away. Extra firewood gathered in September might become essential in February. Additional grain stored after harvest might save a family during the hungry months. Patience became a practical skill. Winter reinforced that lesson every year. Yet patience was not always easy. Consider the experience of a child during a particularly long winter. Days might seem repetitive. Opportunities for movement could be limited. Outdoor activities might be restricted by weather. The same rooms, the same people, the same routines. Again and again. Even adults often experienced a sense of confinement. Houses were small. Privacy was limited. Families spent extended periods in close proximity. This could strengthen relationships, could also create tension. Human nature has changed very little. Medieval households contained disagreements, frustrations, irritations, and conflicts just as modern households do. Winter intensified these dynamics simply because people spent more time together. This is another detail that often disappears from romantic images of medieval life. The hearth could be comforting, could also be crowded. The cottage could provide shelter, could also feel cramped. Family closeness could provide support, could also produce strain. Historical reality usually contains both sides simultaneously. One reason winter felt endless was because escape options were limited. During warmer months, people dispersed across fields, roads, workshops, markets, and grazing areas. Winter concentrated life. The social world became smaller. The physical world became smaller. The visible world became smaller. Darkness reinforced this effect. When evening arrived early, daily horizons narrowed further. Much of life unfolded within circles of firelight. Beyond those circles lay uncertainty. Sometimes that uncertainty inspired stories. Medieval winter storytelling deserves particular attention because it reveals something fundamental about how people experienced the season. Stories were not merely entertainment. They served many purposes. They preserved memory. They transmitted values. They explained dangers. They reinforced identity. They helped pass long evenings. In a society where literacy was limited for much of the population, storytelling functioned as an important cultural technology. Winter provided ideal conditions for it. Families gathered. Work could continue near the hearth. Attention focused inward. Stories moved from one generation to another. Some involved saints. Some involved local legends. Some involved animals. Some involved strange events remembered by older villagers. Others blended fact and folklore in ways that are difficult to separate today. What matters is that storytelling helped transform winter from empty time into meaningful time, provided structure, filled darkness, created continuity between generations, and perhaps most importantly, it reminded people that others had endured similar winters before. This reassurance mattered. Human beings often find comfort in shared experience. Medieval communities were no different. Hearing stories about previous hardships could place current difficulties within a broader context. The winter felt long, but others had survived long winters. The food stores seemed low, but others had faced similar shortages. The storms seemed severe, but older generations remembered severe storms as well. Experience became a source of confidence. Not certainty, confidence. There is a subtle but important difference. Medieval people rarely expected certainty. They expected challenges. Confidence came from believing those challenges could be managed. Winter survival depended heavily upon that mindset. The season rewarded persistence more than optimism. It rewarded preparation more than enthusiasm. It rewarded adaptability more than rigid plans. These qualities became woven into everyday life, and they appeared across every level of society. Even monasteries, often imagined as insulated from ordinary concerns, devoted substantial effort to winter preparation. Monastic communities required food, fuel, clothing, and maintenance just like everyone else. They managed lands, cared for livestock, stored grain, maintained buildings, planned for seasonal changes. Winter affected them too. The same was true of castles. Popular culture often presents castles as powerful fortresses immune to seasonal discomfort. In reality, many castles could be surprisingly cold. Large stone structures retained chill. Drafts found their way through openings. Heating vast spaces proved difficult. Wealth improved comfort, certainly, but it did not create modern conditions. Even nobles experienced winter differently than we might imagine. The contrast between rich and poor remained significant, yet everyone lived within a world fundamentally shaped by seasonal limitations. This shared exposure to nature created an unusual form of common experience. A king and a peasant occupied vastly different social positions, yet both understood what winter meant. Both recognized the importance of harvests. Both depended upon food production. Both experienced shortened daylight. Both understood that severe weather could disrupt plans. Winter crossed social boundaries in ways many other challenges did not. Of course, it did not do so equally. Wealth softened hardship. Poverty magnified it. But the season itself remained universal. Perhaps this universality explains why winter occupies such a prominent place in medieval records, literature, folklore, and memory. People remembered winters because winters touched everything. Not every year contained a war. Not every year contained a major political event. Not every year contained a famous disaster. Every year contained winter, and every winter forced people to negotiate the same fundamental realities: warmth, food, shelter, health, time, community, hope. These concerns connected ordinary households across regions and generations. A peasant in northern France, a shepherd in England, a craftsman in the Holy Roman Empire, or a villager in Scandinavia might speak different languages and live under different rulers. Yet winter imposed recognizable challenges upon all of them. The details varied. The experience rhymed. And as spring advanced further, bringing increasing signs of growth and renewal, people began watching another crucial indicator of the year's prospects: the earliest planted fields. Because those fields would soon provide the first meaningful clues about whether the months ahead might bring abundance, adequacy, or anxiety. Across medieval Europe, eyes turned toward the young crops pushing upward through the soil, and with every passing week, communities began measuring not only what they could see, but what those small green signs might reveal about the winter that would eventually come again. It is easy to forget how closely medieval people watched growing things. Today, much of the developed world is separated from agriculture by layers of infrastructure. Food appears in shops. Seasonal failures in one region can often be compensated for by supplies from another. Most people can go weeks without thinking seriously about crop conditions. For ordinary people in medieval Europe, that distance did not exist. The condition of a field was not an abstract economic indicator. It was part of daily life. People passed fields constantly. They worked in them, walked beside them, discussed them, and measured their prospects through them. The appearance of young crops became a topic of conversation in much the same way modern people might discuss the economy, housing costs, or weather forecasts. And beneath those conversations was an unspoken awareness. Every blade of grain represented a future winter. This may be one of the most important reasons medieval winters felt endless. Winter was never entirely confined to winter itself. It stretched backward into previous seasons and forward into future ones. A poor harvest in August could become a cold, hungry January. A harsh February could weaken a family before spring planting. A wet spring could influence the next winter's food supply. The seasons overlapped in people's minds because their consequences overlapped in reality. A medieval villager rarely had the luxury of thinking only about the present month. The future was always approaching through the fields. As spring matured into early summer, the landscape transformed rapidly. What had seemed fragile in March began to look stronger by May. Hedgerows thickened, grasslands expanded, trees regained their leaves, birds nested, livestock spread across greener pastures. Villages became surrounded by evidence of growth. After months of scarcity and restraint, abundance began to reappear. Yet even abundance had limits. One of the great misconceptions about medieval life is the assumption that successful years erased anxiety. They did not. Good years reduced certain worries, but they also created new responsibilities. Crops needed protection. Livestock required management. Buildings needed maintenance. Markets demanded attention. Successful seasons generated work rather than eliminating it. In many ways, medieval people were busiest when conditions were favorable. This created a curious paradox. During winter, people often longed for spring. During spring, they became overwhelmed by tasks. During harvest, they worked intensely. During autumn, they prepared for winter. The entire year consisted of shifting pressures rather than periods of complete ease. Winter felt distinctive because its pressures were concentrated around survival. but every season carried demands. Understanding this broader cycle helps explain why medieval people rarely viewed winter in isolation. Winter made sense only as part of a larger pattern. To survive winter successfully required preparation. To prepare successfully required productive seasons beforehand. Every year became a continuous chain of dependencies. And because those dependencies were so important, medieval communities developed a remarkable awareness of timing. Timing mattered everywhere. Plant too early and frost could destroy seedlings. Plant too late and yields might suffer. Harvest too soon and crops might be underdeveloped. Harvest too late and storms could damage them. Collect hay at the wrong moment and livestock might suffer months later. Much of medieval life involved doing the right thing at approximately the right time. Experience taught these lessons gradually. This is one reason older members of a community often commanded respect. They possessed memories of timing. They remembered what had worked. They remembered what had failed. They carried practical information accumulated across decades. A younger farmer might understand strength and labor. An older farmer often understood rhythm. And rhythm mattered. Winter itself was deeply tied to rhythm. People knew it would arrive. They simply did not know exactly what form it would take. Would it be mild? Would it be severe? Would snow arrive early? Would rains persist? Would rivers freeze? Would roads remain passable? These uncertainties encouraged careful observation. Medieval people often paid attention to seasonal transitions in ways modern people rarely need to. The first frost mattered. The last frost mattered. The behavior of birds mattered. The timing of flowering plants mattered. The condition of streams mattered. Nature provided clues. Not perfect clues, but clues nonetheless. Over generations, communities accumulated extensive local knowledge. A village in northern England might develop different expectations than a village in southern France. A mountain community faced different challenges than a coastal settlement. Winter was experienced differently across Europe. Yet certain themes remained remarkably consistent. Cold, darkness, scarcity, preparation, endurance, waiting. These experiences connected people across vast distances. They also influenced architecture. Consider the medieval house itself. Throughout winter, the home became a defensive structure against the environment. Not a fortress in the military sense, but a shelter against cold, dampness, and darkness. Every feature carried significance. The thickness of walls, the quality of roofing, the position of doors, the availability of fuel, the placement of livestock. Modern housing often prioritizes convenience and comfort. Medieval housing prioritized survival. Comfort existed when possible. Survival came first. This distinction helps explain many features that seem strange to modern observers. Why were animals sometimes kept close to living quarters? Because warmth mattered. Why were rooms crowded? Because heating space was difficult. Why did people share sleeping arrangements? Because conserving heat was practical. Why did smoke-filled interiors persist? Because removing smoke completely was often harder than maintaining warmth. Many aspects of medieval domestic life make more sense when viewed through the lens of winter. The season influenced architecture as surely as it influenced agriculture. It influenced clothing as well. We often imagine medieval clothing in terms of social status or appearance. Yet for ordinary people, clothing was fundamentally protective. Wool became extraordinarily valuable because of its practical properties. Layers mattered. Cloaks mattered. Hoods mattered. Good footwear mattered. A garment that reduced exposure to cold could improve health, comfort, and productivity. The difference between adequate clothing and inadequate clothing might seem small during mild weather. During winter, it could become significant. This created another hidden form of inequality. Wealthier households often possessed more clothing, better materials, and greater opportunities for replacement or repair. Poorer households frequently relied upon garments that had already seen years of use. Winter exposed those differences immediately. The cold had a way of revealing weaknesses: weak roofs, weak walls, weak supplies, weak health, weak clothing, weak harvests. Winter functioned almost like a test administered annually by nature itself. And because it revealed vulnerabilities so clearly, people remembered its lessons. Sometimes those lessons changed behavior. Sometimes they changed communities. Consider what happened after an especially difficult winter. Villages might strengthen storage practices. Families might gather more fuel. Local customs could evolve. Religious observances might gain new significance. Memories of hardship often influenced future decisions. The process was gradual. Yet, over generations, these adjustments accumulated. Medieval society was not static. It adapted constantly. The pace of change was slower than in modern industrial societies, but adaptation remained continuous. Winter played a role in that adaptation. Each severe season became a source of information. Each successful survival strategy became valuable knowledge. This accumulation of experience helped communities endure. It also fostered humility. Medieval people understood, perhaps more clearly than many modern societies, that human plans had limits. A well-prepared family could still encounter misfortune. A hard-working farmer could still face crop failure. A prosperous household could still suffer illness. Winter reinforced these realities every year. Yet it also demonstrated something equally important. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. Ordinary people survived conditions that would challenge many modern assumptions about comfort. They did so not because they possessed extraordinary powers of endurance, but because they learned. They cooperated. They planned. They adjusted. They found practical solutions to recurring problems. The medieval winter story is therefore not simply a story of hardship. It is also a story of competence. A story of communities repeatedly confronting difficult circumstances and finding ways to continue. That competence often remains invisible because it was ordinary. Histories frequently focus on kings, wars, and dramatic events. Ordinary survival rarely receives the same attention. Yet, from the perspective of most medieval people, survival was the central achievement. Not conquest, not political power. Survival, keeping a household functioning through another year, reaching spring, planting successfully, harvesting successfully, preparing once more. These accomplishments rarely appeared in chronicles. They shaped daily existence nonetheless. And perhaps this is why winter occupies such a unique place in historical memory. It transformed ordinary skills into matters of profound importance. A person who knew how to preserve food effectively contributed directly to survival. A person who understood livestock care contributed directly to survival. A person who repaired tools, maintained buildings, or managed supplies contributed directly to survival. Winter made these connections obvious. The season stripped away many distractions. What remained were essentials: food, fuel, shelter, community, time, patience, knowledge. Looking back from the modern world, it is tempting to view these realities as distant. Yet many of the underlying experiences remain familiar. The desire for security, concern about the future, dependence upon community, anxiety during uncertain periods, relief when difficult seasons end. These emotions cross centuries remarkably well. The medieval villager watching young grain emerge from the soil was experiencing something recognizably human. Hope mixed with caution, optimism mixed with memory. Relief mixed with responsibility. The winter had passed, but its lessons remained. And as the growing season advanced further, bringing warmer days and increasing activity across fields, villages, and towns, attention slowly shifted toward another critical moment in the agricultural calendar. The period when people would begin to understand whether the year's promises were becoming reality, and whether the preparations, sacrifices, and endurance that had carried them through winter were leading toward security or toward another cycle of uncertainty. The period when people would begin to understand whether the year's promises were becoming reality, and whether the preparations, sacrifices, and endurance that had carried them through winter were leading toward security or toward another cycle of uncertainty. As the months unfolded, the answer rarely arrived all at once. A medieval year did not reveal its outcome in a single dramatic moment. Instead, certainty emerged gradually, almost reluctantly. Fields thickened, grain heads formed, livestock gained strength. Markets reflected changing expectations. Conversations shifted in tone. What had once been hope slowly became evidence. And for ordinary people, evidence mattered far more than optimism. By late summer and early autumn, communities could finally begin measuring the results of countless decisions made throughout the year. The fuel gathered, the repairs completed, the seed preserved, the animals protected, the risks taken, the risks avoided. Everything came together. This is why harvest season occupied such an important place in medieval life. It was not simply a time of work. It was a time of judgment. A successful harvest did not guarantee comfort, but it created possibilities. Food could be stored. Animals could be fed. Debts could be managed. Winter preparations could begin with confidence rather than fear. And confidence, in a world shaped by uncertainty, was one of the most valuable resources a household could possess. Yet, even during years of relative success, people understood something that modern societies sometimes forget. Security was temporary. The grain-filling storage barns would eventually be consumed. The firewood stacked carefully beside homes would eventually be burned. The preserved food would eventually diminish. The long nights would eventually return. Winter was never far away. Its approach shaped medieval thinking even during the brightest days of the year. That awareness could sound exhausting to modern ears, but it also created a certain clarity. People understood the connection between effort and survival. They understood the importance of preparation. They understood the value of community. And perhaps most importantly, they understood that comfort was not something permanent. It was something maintained. The medieval winter reminds us of this again and again. It reminds us that ordinary life is often built upon invisible labor. The labor of gathering fuel, the labor of storing food, the labor of repairing clothing, the labor of caring for animals, the labor of helping neighbors, the labor of enduring uncertainty. These acts rarely became famous. They rarely entered chronicles or royal records, yet they sustained entire societies. When we imagine the Middle Ages, it is easy to focus on castles, knights, battles, kings, and cathedrals. But most people lived very different lives. Most people measured success more modestly. A roof that held through a storm, a healthy animal surviving until spring, enough grain to reach the next harvest, children making it through another winter. These were victories too, quiet victories, the kind that leave few monuments behind. And perhaps that is why medieval winters felt endless for ordinary people. Not because every day was filled with dramatic suffering, but because winter touched every aspect of existence at once. It shaped food, work, movement, health, family life, religion, memory, and expectation. It shortened days and lengthened worries. It forced difficult decisions. It exposed weaknesses. It rewarded preparation. It reminded people how dependent they were on one another. And yet, year after year, communities endured. They adapted. They learned. They passed knowledge forward. They faced the darkness knowing that others before them had done the same. There is something deeply human in that pattern. Across centuries, technologies, and cultures, people continue to navigate uncertainty in similar ways. They prepare. They hope. They worry. They cooperate. They persevere. The medieval winter was harsher than anything most of us will ever experience. But the emotions surrounding it remain surprisingly familiar. The desire to protect loved ones. The relief of seeing difficult times pass. The satisfaction of preparation paying off. The awareness that another challenge will eventually arrive. Ordinary medieval people were not merely surviving the cold. They were participating in a cycle that shaped nearly every part of their world. A cycle of scarcity and abundance, of darkness and light, of waiting and action, of vulnerability and resilience. And as one winter gave way to spring, one harvest gave way to autumn, and one year quietly prepared the next, millions of ordinary people carried on with lives that rarely appeared in grand historical narratives, yet formed the foundation upon which medieval society itself rested. So when we look back across the centuries and ask why medieval winters felt endless, the answer is not simply that they were cold. It is that winter was never just a season. For ordinary people, it was a test of preparation, patience, community, and endurance. A season that reached into every corner of life, and in doing so revealed both the hardships and the remarkable resilience of the people who lived through it. And perhaps the most enduring lesson is that history is not only made by the famous figures whose names fill books. It is also made by countless ordinary people tending fires before dawn, repairing worn clothing by candlelight, measuring grain carefully through the hungry months, and finding ways to continue when conditions were difficult. Those lives were quieter, but they mattered, and on long winter nights, beneath smoky roofs and fading firelight, they shaped the medieval world one season at a time. Thank you for spending this time exploring the past with me. If there was a detail that surprised you most, or a part of medieval winter life you found hardest to imagine living through, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you'd like more calm, thoughtful journeys into history, I hope you'll join us again for the next story.